You have an unresolved disappearance. You've tried billboards, flyers, psychics, private investigators with little or no progress. Likewise, the searches have failed. The police aren't responding the way they once did. Calls go unanswered. Emails go unanswered. Requests for information are met with, "It's still an ongoing investigation." After studying over 400 disappearances and interviewing nearly 1,000 family members, I've learned something important. Most families are more than capable of moving their investigations forward if they are given the right tools. I'm Ed Dunsel. For the past 10 years, I've analyzed missing persons cases from all over the world, identifying patterns that are often overlooked by others. My goal is to help you better understand what is likely happening in your case. Identify productive next steps. Avoid wasting time and money. And bring structure and clarity to an emotionally overwhelming situation. If you're looking for thoughtful, experienced analysis of your disappearance case, visit missingpersonsconsulting.com to learn more. You've heard of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Secret Service. And I'm sure you've heard of the Naval Criminal Investigation Service and the corresponding agencies in the other military branches. But have you heard of the CGIS? Well, today you get to hear from one of its investigators and his connection to two disappearances recently featured on this podcast. I'm Ed Dunsel, and this is episode 6 of Unfound's continuing coverage of disappearances that occurred off the Atlantic coast of Florida during the 1980s. As you all know by now, I don't have many actual investigators on Unfound. Why? Because I'm not in it's an ongoing investigation, so I can't tell you anything business. Nope, I'm in the information business. If the guest isn't going to say anything informative, I have no reason to talk to that person. Yes, that includes family members. Yet, to be honest, we've had a few investigators who have revealed quite a bit. Officer Adam Turner, who finally resolved the disappearance of Mary Jane Van Gilder. Special Investigator Jeff Heggie of the Milford Police Department for the disappearance of William Charles Jones Jr. Rich McHale, investigator who was at one time responsible for the investigation into the disappearance of Mark Heimbaugh. And I thank all three of them for appearing. Well, today we get to add another government investigator to that list. But he comes from an agency that most likely you don't even know exists. But first, Unfound News. A new Your 2-Minute Disappearance lesson is out on the YouTube channel. I give you the essentials on what you need to know about video evidence in regards to missing persons cases. Next, it appears myself and aviation reporter and Flight 370 expert Jeff Wise will be getting together to discuss a missing jet from 1990. Stay tuned. Finally, I will be making an appearance on another show as well. However, I'm going to keep that one a secret until it happens. I'll be discussing a disappearance that Unfound featured way back in 2016. A note before the interview starts. 50% of our talk focuses on the disappearances of Angela Westberry and Theresa Hickmon. If the details of their case have already become foggy to you, you may need to go back and refresh your memory to fully understand my interview with this investigator. Also, please allow me to play this disclaimer before I do the interview with our guest.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not here in my official capacity. The Coast Guard and the Coast Guard Investigative Service have sort of allowed me to come here to kind of talk within the confines of not divulging any sort of law enforcement techniques or anything that's sensitive. And, I'm going to stick to kind of what's in the public record and what you guys in the FOIA request. But it's important for you and your listeners to know that nothing that I'm saying is the official sort of position of the Coast Guard or the Coast Guard Investigative Service.
I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the CGIS Supervisory Special Agent, Caleb King. Caleb, welcome to Unfound.
Thanks, Ed. I know this has been a long time in the works to get me here, so I'm glad that we were finally able to make this happen. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you to yourself for making the time, and everybody else who has been instrumental in you appearing today. And today, by the way, for everybody, is May 28th of 2026. I know this is you are maybe our second federal investigator who has appeared on Unfound, and it's a great joy for me. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Let's start here. Of course, we want to talk about yourself a little bit. Maybe just talk about yourself, and then we'll get into what the Coast Guard Investigative Service is. But maybe as much as you want to say just about, a little maybe personal information. Once again, you don't have to go deep if you don't want to.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a special agent, currently a supervisory special agent with the Coast Guard Investigative Service. Been with the, we call it CGIS or CGIS. Been with CGIS about 6 years. Prior to that, I was with another federal law enforcement agency for about 7.
Okay.
And prior to that, I was a deputy sheriff in a county in the Central Florida, and I spent about 8 years on active duty in the Marines.
Wow.
So yeah, I've done quite a few things, kind of all law enforcement related, and I'm currently with CGIS. And CGIS is a lot of people are familiar with the TV show NCIS.
Sure.
And actually, if you watch that, there is some recurring characters from CGIS that do appear on there on a fictional show. So we're like NCIS in some ways, but in a lot of ways we're very different because the Coast Guard, unlike the other military services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, etc., the Coast Guard has an external law enforcement mission. The Coast Guard, for a long time, has been the nation's primary law enforcement agency on the water. So there's certain things that the Coast Guard has regulatory authority for. There's certain things on the high seas that only the Coast Guard can do. And a lot of stuff, like I said, the Coast Guard regulates. So with that, there's crimes that go along with that. So basically, CGIS, in addition to investigating members of the Coast Guard that are engaged in serious felony crime, we also protect the commandant of the Coast Guard, just like you would think of like a small Secret Service type detail.
Interesting.
But then we also have this external criminal investigative mission related to, if it involves a boat, something moving on the water, you name it, and that ranges from crimes on vessels, U.S. flag vessels worldwide, which are always subject to U.S. jurisdiction, to pollution, to smuggling of weapons, narcotics, aliens, all manner of things. So CGIS is a small agency, but we have a very, very diverse mission, and there's a lot of overlap with other federal agencies. Like you can imagine, if we're investigating drug smuggling, there's going to be overlap with the DEA, Homeland Security investigations, and the FBI, and things like that. But there's a couple of things that that are really unique to us that we really try to specialize in, and that's really just crimes involving vessels and boats, because we are the some people call us the FBI of the ocean.
Right.
So that's kind of where we try to specialize in.
Right.
Hopefully that all makes sense.
Right, sure. I have to ask, we don't have to get way deep into your background. Obviously, you were kind of land-based. What drew you to the CGIS? What was it? After a variety of different law enforcement agencies, what drew you to the CGIS?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think when you look at federal law enforcement, most federal law enforcement agencies are doing investigations that are large financial crimes, maybe drug smuggling conspiracies, not a whole lot of real sort of what you might call whodunit detective work. Most of that is done, at least in America, it's done by your local or your state police.
Right.
Most federal law enforcement cases, they're big financial conspiracies, drug trafficking conspiracies, where you have an idea who the person was that was doing it. You just have to do a lot of work to build up the evidence. So something that always drew me to CGIS was the diverse portfolio of different types of investigations that they were able to do. Because we do investigate sort of whodunits, involving things that happen on a boat where this is a real mystery.
Right.
Not a whole lot of federal agencies get to do that, and I also think I like the fact that the Coast Guard is a military service, a search and rescue, service, and also a law enforcement agency. Also, and it's a small armed service, but it has a lot of diverse authority. And to be a criminal investigator within the Coast Guard, I always thought that was really interesting. So when I came to a point where I was looking at making sort of a change, with the agency I was working at, this was one of the few places that I thought about jumping ship to because of that diversity.
Uh-huh. Forgive the pun.
I had to throw a nautical term.
Yeah, that's. Please.
Yeah, and I'm a lot of people think that every CGIS agent is in the Coast Guard, and we're not. We're small. Like I said, we're probably just under 300, and we're about an equal mix on the full-time side. We're about an equal mix of members of the Coast Guard that are in the military that come over to CGIS as special agents after they've done another job in the Coast Guard. So they bring that experience, whether they were a bosun's mate or a medical person or the aviation person, and then they come over to us, and they're still in the Coast Guard, but they do the rest of their career assigned to us. And then the other half is civilian special agents like I am, which is the federal job code is 1811. That's the same job code as an FBI, Secret Service DEA agent. And some of the civilians in CGIS, some of us used to be in the Coast Guard, some of us used to be in other military services, and some of us never were. So, some of us came from other federal law enforcement agencies. We have Secret Service agents and ATF agents that have come over, and some were local cops. So that mix of experiences is really important because you rely on all of it with some of the stuff we do to have that diverse background in the workforce.
Right. And so each CGIS member has his or her own area, areas of the United States, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So our footprint, we have a few. Not right now, not as many as we used to. We have a few agents overseas. Most of our offices are in the United States. Okay. Mostly along the coast. So if there's a large Coast Guard presence there, there's typically going to be a CGIS office there. So yeah, we're sort of geographically kind of set up throughout the country, where to kind of align with the Coast Guard footprint. But that's based how CGIS is sort of set up.
Okay. And when being that you said you've been there for about 6 years, I'm not asking for any specific case or anything, but, percentage-wise, how would you break down, like, what are the big percentage of cases that you've been involved in? Once again, I'm not looking for any names or what happened or anything, but how does your investigations usually break down as far as the kind of crimes that you're usually being involved in?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. So within CGIS, across our offices across the country, it's different. Mm-hmm. And for example, the types of cases we do in Miami are very different from what our offices in Boston are doing, for example, right. Or St. Louis or even Alaska. So in some CGIS offices, they do a lot of what we call UCMJ, which is the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or military justice cases. Those are members of the Coast Guard, active duty members of the Coast Guard that have been accused of some serious crime, domestic violence, sexual assault, occasionally even things more serious than that, because the military has its own sort of legal system.
Right.
So the military members of the Coast Guard are subject to that, just like somebody in the Army, Navy, and Marines is. Okay. So some parts of the country, CGIS does a lot of those, and in other parts of the country, not too many. So the other thing we do is the external investigations. These are things that range from pollution to crimes on the high seas to frauds against the Coast Guard, drug trafficking, human trafficking, illegal charters. It's a real interesting variety of how many different crimes can be associated to things on the water. But if you think about it, and there's a lot. The United States we have a lot of water, we have a lot of coast, we have a lot of big maritime industry here.
For sure.
So there's a lot of, every licensed mariner in the United States, everyone with a merchant mariner credential, captain's license, that license is issued by the Coast Guard. So, their application, if there's anything that's false in it or is untrue, that could be a crime. A lot of boats are documented by the Coast Guard, so there's paperwork with that, and so it's really diverse. But that's in Miami, we don't do a whole lot of cases involving Coast Guard members that are sort of in trouble. Not a whole lot of those, but some here and there. But we in Miami being a sort of a border area, a maritime border, we have a lot of smuggling, and we have a lot of there's a lot of financial crimes involving the maritime industry down here, and we at least for my 6 years here, we've done a lot of homicides involving boats. Most of these are manslaughter, where it was some sort of accident involving some sort of negligence, where it's subject to Coast Guard jurisdiction. But every now and then, we do get something that doesn't look. It's a homicide, but it's not the manslaughter type. It's the actual, it's the murder type.
Yeah,
you don't get a whole lot of those, but those do come along once in a while.
All right. Just as you're saying this, we'll just keep it to maybe something like along the manslaughter lines. Maybe something like drunk boating, like operating a boat with, would that be something that's under your jurisdiction? Somebody drinking and boating, and there's a death.
Yeah. So
something like that.
Yeah. So the Coast Guard, typically when you think of the Coast Guard, you think of the smaller Coast Guard boats out of stations going out and doing boardings and checking for safety equipment, life jackets. They can certainly investigate. They certainly can they were able to make arrests for boating under the influence, and then those typically get turned over to the local or state police, wherever they're at. Right. But the Coast Guard is authorized to, make arrests for boating under the influence. We're not going to get involved in something like that unless it was a vessel engaged in commercial service.
Right.
So any vessel engaged in commercial service, where the operator is, sort of under the influence, if that results in a death,
Right.
we would certainly get involved in that. Most of the times, your state Marine Patrol, wherever you're at, is going to handle those, but we offer assistance. So, like in Florida, you have Florida Fish and Wildlife. They investigate lots of boating accidents, fatalities, DUIs, and things like that. And some of them are can get a little bit complex. We do offer assistance to them, so we will help them. Kind of in the same way the FBI assists other agencies,
right.
Not taking it over, but we just provide some assistance here or there.
Right. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking this must be difficult just as you like commercial vessels because, of course, most people are experiences with cars. And if there is something like this, there's a wreck and you might have skid marks, you might have video. But for something like you might be involved in, like a commercial vessel, like several miles offshore, and something like this happens, if if it is in your jurisdiction, you got none of that. It's there's not video out there in the middle of the water. There's no skid marks in the water. It must be a lot more complex. Is something that comes to mind. What would you say?
No, it absolutely is. You can. There's a case in the news that we're not going to get into, but
right.
It involves a sailboat in another country,
right.
that may have involved some type of nefarious activity, but it's not a whole lot of cameras. If you get into a car accident driving
right.
through town, there's surveillance cameras everywhere, traffic cameras. You can normally find that stuff. Those don't really exist on the ocean, especially if you're far away from, a city where you might be going through a river or something like that, where you may get some cameras. So we don't have that. We don't really have, you don't leave skid marks on the water like you do in a car.
Right.
So, but there is a lot of information you can get. It's just very, very different. But it pertains to getting the boat and looking at damage, and a lot of it now is the electronics on the vessel really can tell a big story. But you're absolutely right. It is a real challenge, and that's an area where we tend to specialize in, because it's the one thing that we do that not a whole lot of federal agencies do, is dealing with crimes involving boats on the high seas and whatnot.
Right. And I'm guessing being that you've been there for 6 years, it doesn't sound to me, maybe at least part of your history that you described, this is maybe something you get some training when you join. Yes. or what?
Yes. So there's training. There's different courses that we go to, some in-house training. A lot of it is on the job. There's no teacher-like experience, so a lot of it is just kind of learned. But thankfully the Coast Guard's been around a long time, so there's a lot of people within the Coast Guard Investigative Service that before they became agents, they were Coast Guard coxswains, boat drivers, and they've got hours and hours of time operating vessels underway. So they know, one of the things the Coast Guard likes to say is the Coast Guard makes the world's best boat drivers. And I think that's probably true, because the Coast Guard just spends so much time with relatively small boats and drivers. So Coast Guard coxswains are very, very skilled, and we have a lot of expertise within the Coast Guard about that. All of these certificated vessels that are inspected vessels, those are all inspected, and their manufacturing has to be approved by the Coast Guard. So you have a whole community within the Coast Guard of literally experts on the construction and design of boats. So that expertise comes into play when there's some sort of accident involving a boat, is we have experts that understand, what crush damage looks like on a boat and damage to a hull and things like that. So it's it's a very, very specialized area, but it's something that we do that not a whole lot of people do.
Regarding, of course, the reason we're here today, of course, is to talk about two specific disappearances. That you've been so helpful, and I think when we get to that part of it, people are just going to be really mesmerized by how you even got involved with Theresa Hickmon and Angela Westberry's disappearances. But just disappearances in general, what would be a general type of disappearance like out in the water, that the CGIS, I'm not asking for any specific case, just a general idea of where the CGIS would be involved here in 2026?
Yeah, so these people disappear in the ocean more often than you might think. It's an ocean. The ocean, they say it's unforgiving. You can just you can disappear in the ocean, and it's hard to find people. But when we get people that go missing, whether it's a boat that capsizes or someone falls off a cruise ship, the Coast Guard is very much involved with the search and rescue for that.
Yeah.
The Coast Guard's got a pretty good track record of finding people, and sometimes we don't find them. But some of those are not just sort of accidents. Some of those there is foul play, or there is the potential for foul play.
Yes.
And when that happens, when the vessel when the boat is in federal waters, so that varies where you're in the country, but sometimes it's 3 miles, sometimes it's 12. But so many miles off the coast of a state, you're in federal waters. Okay. So that is the state law doesn't apply out there in most cases. So it's federal law, which is the Coast Guard or the FBI out that they can enforce law out there. Or if it's a U.S. flag vessel, so a U.S. boat anywhere in the world, it's technically subject to jurisdiction of the Coast Guard. Mm-hmm. So, those are some areas where the Coast Guard could be involved in sort of, looking into, a disappearance where somebody went missing off of a boat under different circumstances.
Right, as we often hear, unfortunately it happens way too much, and you start to wonder, is this an accident, is it suicide? As you've already brought up, like a cruise ship. Cruise ships going down in the Caribbean, and they think somebody went into the water. Certainly that is something that would be a Coast Guard jurisdiction, and maybe, just maybe, the CGIS could be involved. It's not a guarantee, but it could be.
Yeah, so cruise ships are a little different. A number of years ago, the Coast Guard and the FBI signed a memorandum of understanding that you can read about online if you want it, that gave the FBI sort of first right of refusal for crimes on cruise ships. The Coast Guard never lost our jurisdiction for it. Just there got to be so many crimes on cruise ships, it was too much for us to handle. So the FBI handles most of those. Sometimes, depending where it happens, the local police department where the cruise ship comes in will take them. But some of them we do. Sometimes it's us helping the FBI. Sometimes it's the FBI just lets us do it. But yeah, we still do some cases involving cruise ships. But the FBI does most of those, but not all of them.
Okay. Just a number, if you even know. Over the past 6 years, you being involved, how many disappearances, current disappearances, not including, of course, the one we're going to talk about from 1984, how many disappearances do you think the CGIS has worked on in the last 6 years since you started? Just even a guess.
Yeah, I could give you a ballpark for what we've done in Miami.
Yeah, that's fine. Maybe, just in Miami, sure. Great.
Yeah, I could give you a ballpark. Disappearance of somebody on a boat in the water, where sometimes they're found, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's negligence involved, sometimes there's not. But I know 1 year where we responded to 5, where they were deaths, involving boats involved in charter operations where somebody died, right here off the coast of Miami. Yeah, I remember 1 year we had 5 of them.
Okay.
We had a few last year, so we get in Miami we get several a year.
Okay.
Where there's either a disappearance, or maybe not a disappearance but somebody was killed in some kind of vessel fatality that we get involved in, and I'm not even giving you the numbers on how many the Coast Guard responds to from purely a search and rescue perspective that has no involvement from us. Right. That number is probably higher than what I just told you.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So that is the CGIS. And I have to be honest, I've never watched the show NCIS. I know that really makes me very backward. But, it sounds to me just in general, and I'm 55 years old, as far as law enforcement agencies go at the federal level, it's probably what we might call one of the more obscure ones, but certainly it sounds like obviously you're doing a lot of important work out there. Obviously, like you said, maybe 300 members in the CGIS, one of the smaller law enforcement agencies at the federal level.
No, we are definitely small, definitely obscure, and sometimes certainly people in the maritime industry tend to know who we are. But sometimes when we're knocking on doors of people's houses or businesses because we need to ask some questions about something, some people get really confused. Wait a minute, you're in the Coast Guard, but you're here in a suit and you have a gun and a badge. It does confuse some people to think that the Coast Guard has federal agents that are basically just like the FBI for the Coast Guard. That does throw people for a loop.
Okay, very good. Okay. Let's move on to this. Fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining all of that. And, of course, giving some of your background and some of the, uniqueness of your agency. Let's move on to this. And everybody should understand, everybody knows how old I am at 55. And this is, we're going to kind of just start wading into of course, we want to talk about the 1980s. And everybody should know Caleb's just, I think, at least just a few years younger than I am. So we were both kids regarding this time, during this time. But being that you're in Miami, you're in the CGIS, your general understanding of what was going on out there in the water during the 1980s. Of course, I think most people are going to think of Miami Vice, but being that you are in it, maybe you've been told some stories of people who came before you. Can you give general explanation about what was going on during the 1980s, please?
I mean, Miami Vice is probably not that far from the truth. I mean, it's definitely sensationalized, and the violence was bigger. But it's not that far from the truth. There was a lot of drug-related, you think of the Cocaine Cowboys, which is a true documentary, and Griselda Blanco and all those people.
Yes.
There was a lot of drug smuggling in the 80s because that was really kind of when the cocaine boom started. There had been smuggling of marijuana into the United States on our maritime borders, in the 70s, probably even prior to that. But really in the early, late 70s, early 80s is when cocaine became the thing. And cocaine was a lot more money than marijuana was. And you saw this construction boom in Miami in the 80s and the violence and a lot of that involved boats. A lot of cocaine moved on planes. But yeah, there was a lot of people that got involved in it in the 80s, and there was a lot of prosecutions because the government had to come down and kind of clean it all up. And I think it's now there's still a lot of drug trafficking that goes on here. You can imagine the fact that we've got a lot of boats coming back and forth from the Caribbean and through South America. There's still a lot of it goes on. Yeah. I don't think it's nearly the level it was in the 80s. But a lot of it's still the same, if that makes sense. So a lot of the smuggling routes of how the traffickers will move cocaine from South America through the Caribbean, ultimately to Florida, a lot of the techniques they used to do it, they've been doing it since the 80s.
Right. And
it's very...
Right, and you even have the notes, of course, the outline that we're following. This goes back to Prohibition even. It's just not, you talked about, of course, the 80s got bigger, but it goes back to maybe the 20s even.
Yeah, I mean, especially between Florida and the Bahamas, if you look at the history of CGIS, we used to be called Coast Guard Intelligence, and we really came to light during Prohibition to collect intelligence on rum runners that were running, rum and other, alcohol from the Bahamas to Florida and elsewhere. And you swap out, alcohol from Prohibition and you replace it with drugs, and it's really the same thing. So these routes, these maritime routes between the Bahamas and Florida, it's been going on for 100 years.
Yeah. And, and once again, I look back at this time, of course, I was in, a little kid in Pennsylvania when this, kind of the newer boom, like we're talking about, 70s into the 80s, it almost seems like the Wild West, being that, we didn't have the technology maybe that we have now. Of course, investigative departments can use, but back then it was a little more of the Wild West, like we might think of like the 1800s, out in Colorado or something. That's almost the feeling that I get. Being that you this is your job, how do you look back at that time? No,
I mean, I think it definitely was, especially compared to how it is now, because you had this sudden sort of influx or boom almost overnight of people looking to smuggle, cocaine in the United States,
right?
Because it was worth so much money. But when that happened, we didn't have enough Coast Guard boats, enough customs boats, enough FBI agents, we didn't have enough people to investigate all that. So
right.
it really was kind of like the Wild West, because it was all over the place, and finally it's somewhat under control now. There's still a lot of smuggling going on, but I don't think it's anywhere near at the level it was in the early 80s.
Right, and I could just throw out some technology, of course, with drones now, maybe with like heat vision, night vision goggles, technology maybe being a lot more advanced. Of course, that can help everything in contrast to back then as well, certainly.
Yeah. There's technology has made this made it a lot easier for law enforcement to get after, but let me tell you, every technological advance law enforcement gets to look at drug traffickers or other crimes, the bad guys are 2 steps ahead. They're going to figure it out.
Yeah, right. It's like back and forth, right?
Yes.
They get good at something, you get better at it. They get, it's back and forth. Who's trying to outwit who, kind of.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And you even have written in the notes here that CGIS did not have the same broad external mission in the early 80s compared to now. Did things change because of this? Because of this, like you're saying, maybe a little overmatched, at least at the start? What can you say?
I don't know, but I do know that back in the early 80s, the Coast Guard was, as we still are, very much involved in trying to interdict drugs on the sea. Yeah. But we were not as engaged with the investigative side of it.
Yeah.
That back then was more, the Customs Service, the DEA, the FBI started to get into drugs in the 80s. Early on, they were not as involved in drugs with smuggling the water. And even back then, I don't think CGIS would have been as involved with just sort of other types of crimes on the high seas. I think we were much smaller back then, and we had to focus a lot more on the internal issues within the Coast Guard and pollution and things. But just like every agency, the FBI of today, it's not the same FBI, 40, 50 years ago. It's very different in terms of what they want to get involved in and how they deal with the public and things like that. So, and I think CGIS is no different in that regard, that we've gone through changes and grown and adapted to society. So yes, my agency probably was not as involved with a lot of these things that we've talked about, or things that you talk about on your podcast, as we are now back in the 80s.
Right. Okay. Very good. And maybe you maybe don't know this, Caleb, but a couple years ago I did have on a retired FBI agent who's now a very good friend of mine. She hosts her own podcast, and she did talk about how things, when she started the FBI, from when she started until when she retired, things changed. Certainly as crimes change, as culture changes, law enforcement changes.
Yeah, you have to adapt to stay relevant.
Yeah.
And sometimes, unfortunately, I think law enforcement were slow to adapt to things that the public needs us to do. But sometimes we get it right eventually, you know.
Yeah. And we should say one more thing, of course, about all this, because this is going to become relevant here in a few moments, is that we're just talking about Florida, but you also had stated to me that, we could even go up the coast along the Atlantic coast, like up to South Carolina, even to North Carolina, as being drop-off points. It's just not limited to Miami. They would take drugs far up the coast.
Yes, I mean Miami. Florida is the closest. Puerto Rico, if you
right.
look at that being in the Caribbean with the proximity to South America, so we're definitely the closest. But it's also where we've got the most Coast Guard boats, aircraft, DEA agents. We've got the most people here watching for this stuff coming in. Well, but as you go a little bit further up the East Coast, we're not looking for that as quite as much because you're getting farther away. So, and every now and then you do hear about in the news, drugs making it all the way, up there. I think you just remind me, a few years ago, I think it's happened a couple times, but you can read about this in the news. One of those narco semi-submersible submarines went all the way from Colombia to Spain. And it got caught in Spain full of cocaine. I mean, think about that. Somebody made a homemade submarine, and they took it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean.
It's crazy.
And that's almost mind blowing.
Right, and that they made it, and of course, taking that risk, especially since it's homemade.
Yes.
Or something.
Yes.
What we don't hear about is all the attempts they maybe tried to make and people got killed. The drug runners and the cocaine or whatever went right to the bottom of the Atlantic. But this is one of the trips that made it.
All of the cocaine subs that didn't make it, right. We don't know anything about.
Right, that's right.
Nobody knows.
That's right. Yeah. But there's so much money in it; it's worth the risk. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess to somebody that is in grows up in sort of a poverty type area country, the amount of money that they could make just on one of those loads can sometimes set their family up for 20 years. Yeah. So, in some ways you sympathize with them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very sad. Very sad.
It is.
Let's I'm going to set this up this way. Being that you obviously, like you said, you worked for a sheriff's department, what kind of you don't have to name any cases or anything like that, what kind of missing persons, even just taking reports, investigating disappearances, as a law enforcement officer before you joined the CGIS, what kind of experience did you have in that area before you happened upon Angela and Theresa?
Really none.
Okay.
Really almost none.
Okay.
When I was a deputy sheriff in Florida, you would occasionally deal with a missing person, normally a child. I think everyone that I was involved in, we always found in a day or two. They're normally runaways. I was had a little bit of experience in my prior law enforcement career in the Department of Defense with some people in the Army involved in sort of attempted murders and things like that. I had a little experience with that.
Yeah.
But really, until I came to CGIS, never had really dealt with a missing person.
Wow.
That resulted in any kind of prolonged investigation. My prior experiences when I was a local cop and parents reported the kids missing. Normally it was a runaway, and they turned up in a couple of days, or you found them at a friend's house. So prior to this, I really had none.
All right, so this sets this all up now that we're into this interview. You know about Caleb, you know about the CGIS, you know about their, what they do, and you now know about Caleb's disappearance background, which isn't extensive, but I don't think that, given doing this 10 years, I don't think that that's rare at all. As I've continued to say, there are many law enforcement officers at all levels, men or women, who can work their entire careers and never have a disappearance that lasts more than a few days. I'm not surprised by this at all. But this is the most fascinating, not the most fascinating, but this is where we're going to start with this. Tell the people how you first heard about Theresa Hickmon and Angela Westberry. How did that happen?
Yeah, so, there's certain times in your life or your career where you just remember where you were when something started. And I've done probably thousands of investigations in my career, and some of them have been very successful in terms of a big prosecution, a big result, got a lot of money back, got some bad people with some appropriate prison sentences. And a lot of them, I can't tell you, I can't remember how it started. This one, I can.
Yeah.
I was, we have a duty agent rotation in CGIS where when you get a duty call, think about it, where you're sort of on duty. If somebody needs to report something to us, we have a phone number that is one phone number from the Miami office, but that phone forwards to the cell phone of whatever agent has duty that week. And I still stay in duty just to sort of help out because we're small, and also because I like the duty calls, because sometimes it's exciting. This is something we get to respond to, because it's in progress. But I was standing duty in November of 2023, and I was driving to work on I-95 and got a duty call, and it was from. We get a lot of duty calls that are a wrong number. They're looking for a different part of the Coast Guard. They're looking for a different CGIS office. They're, occasionally it's a crazy person that is just, ranting.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're reporting something that is a crime, but we're not the right agency, so we'll redirect them. So we get a lot of duty calls that are really, really nothing. Yeah. And so I got this one, and I started thinking, this is going to be sort of nothing. But it was from someone who had gone to high school with one of these girls. It was actually she had gone to I think she was a middle school classmate of Angie.
Okay.
Angela Westberry.
Okay.
And this is the weird thing, and I think you know this by somebody that does a lot of work with disappearances.
Yeah.
They seem to haunt people for a long time.
Oh yeah.
Not even the not just the immediate family, but in this case, this was a classmate of Angie's who wasn't even really that close to her. It's haunted her for 40 years.
Yes.
And she's not even still close with the family at all, with Angie's family, but it's bothered her for 40 years. And for some reason, in November of 2023, she decided to call the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to try to find out if there was an update on Angie's disappearance. She had gone through the internet sleuthing, looking at the stuff on YouTube, looking at the different websites about her, and she called the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office told her that the investigation had been turned over to the Coast Guard. So she found our number and called, and I'd never heard of this story. I'd never heard of the sea fever. I'd never heard of Angela Westberry, Theresa Hickmon. I never heard of it, but she's telling me this story, and I was looking for the part of her story where I was going to tell her, thanks but no thanks. You should really call this agency. This is something we're doing. But I kept listening, and I never got to a point where I could tell her, you got the wrong number. You need to call somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But when she told me that this has been turned over to the Coast Guard, well, I got interested because I've always had an interest in sort of cold cases. Yeah. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Let me see what I can find when I get to the office, get on my computer. And so that's how it started.
Wow. Just right place, right time. If somebody else is on duty, let's just admit it. Nothing against any of your coworkers, but maybe the person doesn't do as much as you have. Maybe. This is not a criticism.
That's possible. That's very, very possible. And in this case, there was no connection really to Miami.
Right. Right.
We have an office in Jacksonville, smaller office, but I could have just referred him to that phone number.
Yeah.
But selfishly, I was interested in this thing, and so I kept it because it was interesting to me. So I kept it for myself, selfishly.
Good for you, Caleb. Good for you. All right. So you get this call. We don't have to get into this woman's name or anything like that, but she told a very compelling story. You've never heard about it. And then I'm guessing you went back to the office or wherever and started looking this up. Something about it, as you've already explained, caught your attention. Talk about those first days or weeks. And did you figure out, could you do something? Of course, it's, at this point, it's almost 40 years old. I mean, you're probably thinking, well, how much can I do here? But what was going through your head, and what was, your first steps, impressions?
Yeah. So, no, and you're absolutely right that, even though it's 40 years ago, something that I've come to learn in my law enforcement career is you can really, really never discount anything until you check until you try. And you see this all the time on true documentary TV shows of these old cases that have been solved 40, 50, 30 years ago. And so I knew this was a long shot, but there was enough there that I was interested in, enough that I thought it was worth looking into. And especially when JSO told this person it had been turned over to the Coast Guard, well, I felt like I had an obligation to make sure that the family knew what the outcome of the Coast Guard investigation was. And as I found out, we didn't have one. So there was no investigation by the Coast Guard. But I started one.
Wow. Of course, is this something, being that it's back, just a procedural thing, being that it's 40 years in the past, you have to get like approval of like a supervisor? Hey, I got this call, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure my supervisors were. I'm sure they weren't super thrilled that I was working a 40-year-old case of two women that went missing on a boat with really no information. I'm sure they weren't super thrilled by it, but I think they supported me because I've got a good track record of working hard and bringing results for the good cases. So this honestly became a little bit of a side project, but thankfully, CGIS is a good agency in that they allowed the kind of freedom to kind of look into a little bit and see what we came up with. And I'm sure some supervisors may have told me to shut this thing down, but thankfully, thankfully I was allowed to kind of see where this thing goes.
Okay. So once again, you start doing your work. And once again, we are not, of course, it's still unsolved. Theresa and Angela, along with a couple young men or middle-aged men, are still missing. We're not here to get in the way of the investigation, but what can you say about your initial conversations and strides you tried to make to put a file together on this?
Yeah, so just from that phone call from that classmate of Angie's, I just had the names of the girls, which I was able to find on the internet. There's the missing person information about them,
right?
But there wasn't really a whole lot else. If you get into the internet, you can see. I think there was some of the family. I think Angie's family. They went on Montel Williams or something, or Phil Donahue with a sidekick.
Yeah.
I think you can find, as anybody that takes an interest in looking at this disappearance, you end up stumbling across that. So, you get the name of the boat, the Sea Fever, and I think that they left Jacksonville to go on a cruise with these men that they had met.
Right.
And never came back. I think you can find some information online about the phone call that Theresa Hickman's mother got from the Cayman Islands. It was kind of a strange phone call, I think on December 14th in 1984 it was. Yeah. But other than that, there's really not a whole lot out there.
I know. Don't I know? And if you don't know, I mean, I've known about their disappearances for a long time, well before I started this podcast. But I really got interested in like 2016, 2017 when I originally spoke to two of Angela's sisters. Of course, they've already appeared on this series, and then I got to speak to Theresa's parents. Of course, her father is now deceased, but you're right. Not a lot of information out there at the time.
There's not. So, but when I started looking into some law enforcement databases that even has information that the federal government has even back this far, I actually found some things. And I was able to get, was a detective in the missing persons unit, JSO, that was actually very helpful. I don't even think he was born when these girls went missing. He's even younger than I am, but he was very helpful.
Yeah.
And was able to get the records they had. He went into their archives and found the original, 1984, 85, 86 JSO investigation, which had a little bit more information. So between that and what I found in some information the Coast Guard had access to that was still there this long ago, I was able to sort of piece some things together.
All right, and what were some of those pieces?
Well, the biggest thing that started it was the sea fever. This boat.
Yeah.
I think the summer prior to this happening. So I think that summer, the Coast Guard had caught that boat smuggling weapons off the coast of Fort Pierce, Florida.
Weapons, guns, like rifles or whatever else.
Wow. I don't know what kind. It was just guns.
Okay.
And there was a person on the boat who there was a record on this person, and something that I came to learn about, this case, which is part of the reason why I think there was so little information and such difficulty with the investigation that JSO did so many years ago, is everybody knows that the girls went off with, some reports say 2 men. There was actually a third man.
Yeah.
Well, they were using aliases.
Yeah.
So a lot of people didn't know who they were.
Right.
I was able to piece together who they really were, and I think you've said two of the names on one of your your episodes on this one. I think that may have been the first time that at least 2 of those names came out, and I'll tell you the third name, and there's a fourth guy.
Right.
But I think that's part of the reason of the difficulty is, we knew who Angie and Theresa were back then. And, Angie was technically a juvenile, so she was 17, so that investigation was treated differently because it was a juvenile, so there's some different things you have to do and some different things about a missing juvenile. But nobody really knew who the men were.
That's right. Right.
And, but I know who they were, and I've spoken to relatives for all 3 of them and was able to, confirm that, yeah, it was them. And even the third guy, who kind of played the smallest role in this, that was on the boat, his sister is still alive, lives not too far from, I think, where you're at, Ed. Mm-hmm. She knew her older brother, she knew he had disappeared on a boat, but didn't really know that it was this boat and this story. I think when I spoke to her, she was kind of familiar with the Angie and Theresa story, but she didn't know that her brother was on that boat. And I think I found her in 2024. So imagine, her parents had passed on, but just imagine that family knowing that their loved one, their son, their brother disappeared on a boat, but having no other information about it in terms of, when and where, the name of the boat, who they were with. They didn't know.
Right, and I want to go back to something. Once again, it's up to you whether you want to use some of these names, although, like you said, a couple of them have already been mentioned in this series and talking to Anita and Denise. But going back to the boat having guns on it, just a few months before, did they just let this guy go? Once again, if you want to use his name or not, up to you, but they just let this guy go? They just let the boat go? Because running guns seems like a serious offense. Any insight into that?
Yeah, so I'll So your researcher Eric was able, submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Coast Guard.
Right.
You got some records that were redacted, and there's some other information that Eric has kind of found with some of this stuff as a guide. So I will. There's a couple things that I'm not going to say because. My agency. I'm not here as
no explanation
I'm not here officially.
Needed. Yep, no explanation.
I'm not here in an official capacity, but they were comfortable with me doing this on my own, so long as we kept to certain rules.
Right.
Which you've been very very good about making sure we accommodate that we're going to do. But
absolutely, I'm not here to once again get anybody in trouble or get in the way of anything. You just do what you think is best. Totally fine.
But that being said. Just about all of these names are the records are out there and you've got them. So I'm able to tell you the names because it's been public. There's a couple of them that I think are not, but we'll be careful of those. But yeah, so when I go back to the aliases, the one individual that I knew was on the boat when the Sea Fever was sort of busted by the Coast Guard moving weapons in the coast of Fort Pierce in the summer. Well, his name, as the Coast Guard had him on that boat, was Stephen Duffy. Stephen Duffy's not his real name.
Okay.
And so that was part of the challenge, I think, in investigating. Is all these guys had fake names, and back in the 80s, it was really easy to get a real Florida driver's license and a fake name because we didn't have the real ID and all this electronic, verification with fingerprints and photos. So a lot of people had real Florida driver's licenses in fake names. I think it was pretty rampant in the 80s, 90s. I think today it's to a lesser degree because the security controls have gotten so much. So a lot of these guys, they had real driver's licenses and an alias, and they even had criminal history where they had been arrested in the alias. And back then when you got arrested, you were fingerprinted. Those ink fingerprint cards were mailed off to the FBI, and several months later sometimes the FBI would say, "Oh, no, these fingerprints for Stephen Duffy are actually not Stephen Duffy. This is somebody else." So eventually it would catch up to you. Now, most fingerprinting when you get arrested, it's instantaneous.
Right.
Within minutes, they know, if you've been arrested under that name before, if you're giving a different name, things like that. Back then, that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
So I was able to sort of figure out who these people were because they had been arrested under the alias, but then eventually the fingerprints catch up, and so that alias gets associated to the real name. So that's part of how I was able to figure out who some of these people were. But as to your question about why the Sea Fever was allowed to go after it was caught with guns, I don't know. There's no. There could be a number of reasons why, but there's no record in anything that I can find that explained why the boat and Stephen Duffy was sort of allowed to go. I don't know, but the Coast Guard did sort of put a lookout on that boat as being involved in drug smuggling. And when you look at some of the older JSO reports, JSO knew that the Coast Guard had told them that they were aware that the Sea Fever had been moving drugs even prior to Angie and Teresa's disappearance. And also the three guys. This is often the Angela, Westberry, and Theresa Hickmon disappearance. But as you mentioned, there was three other people that disappeared as well.
Right.
You just didn't know who they were.
Right.
So it's really the five of them. But yeah, that's kind of how it started. And once I sort of figured out who the real names were, there were some records involving the Sea Fever and some of the names of the Hanna brothers that I think you've already mentioned who they were.
Yes.
Well, in the early 80s, there was a customs agent, with the U.S. Customs Service that had been investigating the Hanna brothers for moving drugs with the Sea Fever out of Morehead City, North Carolina. And he had made a record that they had obtained fraudulent Florida driver's licenses, and I think I don't have those reports in front of me. Those are not things that were released, but I think he even identified the aliases, and these are the aliases that JSO had for the guys. So that's how another way I was able to figure out who they really were.
Yeah, right. And so it sounds to me, once again, if it's something different, please say so. Really, it sounds to me like the break in the case was identifying the sea fever from earlier that year and actually putting somebody on the boat, even though it took a while, actually being able to put somebody physically on the boat who was arrested for something, even though it was a fake name. That was kind of the thing that kind of catapulted you into this other stuff.
Yes, and also with Stephen Duffy's name, took us a little. It was a little harder to figure out who it really was.
Yeah.
But one of the when I was talking about CGIS before, we also have reservists. So we have members of the Coast Guard Reserve that are assigned to a CGIS, so they're kind of like part-time, special agents for CGIS. But these are in their regular jobs. They are police officers. We have ATF agents, a couple of FBI agents. They do something in their regular job, and then their part-time military job is a CGIS agent. Well, at the time, we had a CGIS agent, reserve agent in my office, who was in charge of the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force down here. And the Marshals Service, one thing they're really, really good at is finding people using old records and systems. That's just they have very specific skills about it.
Yeah.
He kind of figured out who Stephen Duffy really was, using some of those techniques that the marshals. I might have figured out eventually, but he figured out much quicker, and that's how we figured out who he really was. And so the Hanna brothers were from Pinellas County, Florida.
Yep, where I live. Yes.
At one point, they had an address in Madera Beach,
where I used to live.
Yeah. They moved there in high school from Texas. And then at some point in the 70s, they start getting arrested for, kind of silly stuff, but they've got arrest records that you can still go to the Pinellas County Clerk of Court website and see them. They're still there. Pinellas County has a more inclusive, robust public records database than a lot of counties in Florida. It's actually kind of impressive how far it goes back with how much is in there. But you can see they were getting arrested there. And I think there was nothing real violent, maybe some burglary here and there, trespassing, possession of marijuana, things like that. And I can tell you they also had arrests in New Orleans. And then I also could place them in Morehead City, North Carolina. That's where the Sea Fever was purchased.
Right.
The Sea Fever was purchased from a guy who was also suspected of being a narcotics trafficker by the Customs Service in Morehead City in the early 80s, who was a school teacher. He had owned the Sea Fever, and then he sold it to one of the Hanna brothers. A lot of sort of speculation about why he sold it. Did he sell it because he was just getting out of it, he wanted the money, or was it more of a straw purchase because he wanted to keep his name off of it? And the Hanna brothers are working with him. I don't know. I do know that Stephen Duffy, whose real name is he goes by Ed Barnes, but he goes by Fast Eddie.
That's right.
He also had some ties to Morehead City. So, and he's from the Detroit area. Those locations are very significant, and we won't get into the bigger drug thing that was going on.
Right.
We won't get into a whole lot of detail.
Right. Yeah.
But if you get into the history of some of the bigger drug trafficking groups in the early 80s in the United States, for some weird reason, a bunch of these guys came from Pinellas County. Had ties to Pinellas County. Some of them are famous. Lee Rich, Stephen Kalish, they testified in Congress and testified, and then they ultimately led to the invasion of Panama and the indictment of Noriega. They had Pinellas County connections. They were moving boats with cocaine up into Morehead City, North Carolina, which is where one of their boats was caught and ultimately started the whole thing. And some of these guys are still, some are still alive, and they're definitely not smuggling anymore. They're older, but they're still around. You can go bump into some of these guys in Clearwater Beach. They're still around.
Let's not. I'm not going to do that, Caleb.
yeah, but they're still around, and some of them are. There's one of them has even written a book that I think just got published. His name is Tommy Powell, but he's still over there. But yeah, there was a weird thing where a lot of these guys came from Pinellas County, and so that's an important part of the connections.
Yeah.
New Orleans also. These guys have been in New Orleans. There was and then I think I told you about Fast Eddie's connection with Detroit,
right.
and Fast Eddie was a self-professed member of the Hells Angels. If you look at the drug trafficking that was going on in Morehead City in the early 80s, and there's some books about this, the police were corrupt. I think there was a mayor that was involved. The Hells Angels were really, really involved with when the drugs came in to Morehead City on boats. They were involved in the distribution. And Fast Eddie has told numerous people that he was a Hells Angel. I think he was a documented Hells Angel. But his connection to Detroit is interesting because one of the guys who was one of these big, sort of smugglers in the early 80s that was involved on the periphery with some of the guys that I'd mentioned that were involved with the whole Panama Noriega thing was a guy named Mike Vogel. Mike Vogel since passed away, but he had guys, he was taking the drugs to Detroit that just first started the Midwest, but he was bringing them in a lot through New Orleans. Well, the Hanna brothers had arrests in New Orleans. So you've got New Orleans, you got a Detroit connection, you have Pinellas County, and you have Morehead City.
Yeah.
A lot of very interesting things happened there with a lot of bigger, well-documented, well-known drug smuggling groups, and I think that's enough to kind of tell you what was probably going on here.
And I should explain, if everybody doesn't know Florida, when he says Pinellas County, that is where I live. That is where Clearwater is. That is where St. Pete is. That is where, currently, at least at this point, where the Tampa Bay Rays play. That is in Pinellas County, but this is on the Gulf Coast. Of course, the disappearances happened the whole way on the other side of the state in the Atlantic Ocean. Just so everybody understands that, just for anybody who doesn't know how Florida is. I do want to ask you this. Maybe we don't need to get into his name. Of course, you make the choice on that. But did you look up this guy who owned the Sea Fever and shady guy, or like you said, could it be he was in league with these people? Of course, being a school teacher is going to really ruffle a lot of feathers out there. What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, he had he had sort of some records of being suspected of being involved in smuggling drugs, living beyond his means. He's since passed on as well. I think his name was Kalfer.
Okay.
But Eric, I think, was able to find some public records that can have that, so you'll be able to confirm that with him. Because I think some of the things that the Coast Guard did not release to you under FOIA, some of them Eric was able to find anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I never found any proof that he was smuggling drugs at all. But I do know that he sold the boat to one of the Hanna brothers, and the Hanna brothers were sort of well documented with arrests for drug possession, things like that. Yeah. And even some of their family members, I think, kind of knew what was going on. So, I don't know. I don't know if he was sort of just falsely suspected of it, being a high school teacher with this kind of larger boat on the side. I don't really know.
Yeah. But
I do know from speaking to people that were, I spoke to a couple FBI agents that were very much involved in the Noriega sort of case, and that were out of North Carolina. And they told me, in certain terms, in the early 80s in Morehead City, North Carolina, there was more people involved with the cocaine trade than were not. And I don't think they were exaggerating, and that's certainly not the case now. So, it probably was. I even spoke to the whole reason we were able to make this connection is I told you about the records that had been placed on the Hanna brothers of being suspected of smuggling drugs and the sea fever and all that. Well, that was done by a customs agent out of New Bern, North Carolina in the early 80s, who's long since retired, but he's still around. He's retired now in Vermont, and he was able to confirm some of this. And, my phone call to him was very interesting as well. When I called him, I told him who I was, sort of made sure he was the retired U.S. Customs Service agent, and he said he was, and I said, well, I'm actually, I said, hey, this is a bit of a long shot, calling you out of the blue. You may not remember anything, but I'm calling about a boat that you had put some records on in the early 80s. And I'll never forget what he told me. He said, you're calling about the sea fever and those two girls.
Wow. Now, just so we're getting a little lingo here, put some records on. What does that mean, like, for the layman?
Yeah, those are those. When I was sort of talking about those records that we put on in a federal system that the Coast Guard, Customs Service, and other agencies use to sort of put records of lookouts of people and boats.
Lookouts, okay.
Yeah, he had put some lookouts on some folks, and I found some information that was still there.
Okay.
And he had been a customs agent for 20 years. Doing back then, all the Customs Service really did was smuggling of goods in the United States. That's really all they did. The Customs Service now is Homeland Security investigations. They got a much broader mission. But back then, all he did for 20 years was mostly drugs and other contraband getting smuggled in on aircraft and the waters. Mm-hmm. He's probably dealt with hundreds of boats. He remembered that one.
Wow.
And he told me, he said, I knew somebody was going to call me about this one day. He said, I didn't think it would take 40 years. And I wish that phone call had been recorded and we could have played it for you, because that's almost exactly what he said.
Wow. So, yeah. Where did the conversation go from there, if you can say?
Yeah. So he remembered quite a bit. There was a couple of things he didn't remember that I was able to sort of refresh his memory with the records that he had put. But he had made a lot of cases with the FBI. And some with the FBI, some with just him. He'd made a lot of cases on drug smugglers in Morehead City in the 80s, and he remembered the sea fever because of the disappearance of the girls. Mm-hmm. And he told me that he had communicated with the JSO detectives at the time because the boat had come out of there. And then I think this is something that's also one of the small pieces of public information that's been out there even prior to me sort of getting involved, was that there was a sighting of the sea fever a couple years later.
Yes.
I think that's out there. Yeah. I think Angie's dad, or not Angie, I think Theresa's dad even drove up to look for it and just missed it.
That's right.
But he was the reason why we know the sea fever. I mean, I'm not completely certain that the same sea fever is the one that showed back up a couple years later. I'm a little bit on the fence.
Yeah, sea fever, common name for boats. Common name.
It's a fairly common name for a boat.
Yeah.
But this boat was kind of distinguishable, and I think the sighting of it was 1986 or 87. It was a couple years after the disappearance of the girls, which people knew about, and this customs inspector certainly knew what it was looked like. And the person that reported it to him was very certain it was the same boat. They missed it. They couldn't find it. I did speak to. We can get to him later, but I'll finish kind of this part about the customs agent. And he was trying to. He was very interested, I think, in trying to help, the investigation into the disappearance of the girls. But, I remember he told me that, JSO at the time, and again, and I think you've said this before, the JSO of today is probably not the same JSO in 1984.
Right.
They probably would take a much different approach to this case today.
Absolutely.
Just like my agency may not have done anything if we were called about. I mean, the Coast Guard was called about the disappearance, and we didn't really do a whole lot. So, this is not a criticism of JSO as they are today. This is kind of how things were.
Right.
Techniques were different, technology, the mindset was different, but there's kind of a theme that there wasn't a whole lot of interest in putting a whole lot of effort into trying to figure out what happened to these folks. Mm-hmm. I think part of the problem was the jurisdiction. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, they don't have jurisdiction, and it's difficult for them to drive to North Carolina. Certainly difficult for them to go to the Cayman Islands. Yeah. And the thing that we didn't talk about that I'm sure we'll get into is the escort service.
That's right. We talked about it, of course, in my interview with we did talk about that. Yeah, that's part of it. It is. Yeah,
that's part of it. But I think there was, and even the customs agent I spoke to had even gotten the same sort of position about this that I think some of the Angie's family got was, well, these two girls were escorts and they should have known better, and this is kind of what you get.
Yep.
And that's not I don't think that's how just about any law enforcement agency or officer agent in the U.S. would think about this now. But back then, that was just kind of the mindset, and I think that is part of the issue why there wasn't a whole lot of effort put into it. Yeah. Maybe it was, part of it was, I think, just being able to connect the dots with all these different systems, technology, being able to tie it all together. But the customs agent told me that, he got the impression that there wasn't a whole lot of interest in trying to do something about it because the girls had been engaged in some sort of escort service or whatever, and maybe they didn't deserve a full investigation. We certainly know that's not the case now. That's certainly not how I feel. And he wanted to get involved a little bit more, but he was very limited in what he could do with his authority as a customs agent at the time. So there was only so much he could do, but he was really trying to help and was trying to keep JSO involved. But it was because of him putting those sort of records in a system which I sought access to. That's probably the only reason I was able to figure out who the Hanna brothers really were,
right?
Because of something he did in the late '80s. Right. But I did interview, and I think you have this in the documents the Coast Guard released to Eric. I did interview. I mean, it's hard to remember how I stumbled upon him, but I did interview somebody who's still alive that was in the Morehead City area who did not know the Hanna brothers. Knew the Sea Fever very well. He told me he was on the Sea Fever, I think he said 1987, 85. Wow. He was on the Sea Fever.
3 years later.
He is certain that he was on the same Sea Fever. So, I put a little bit more credibility into that than I do just the sighting of the Sea Fever in North Carolina that nobody could really confirm. This guy was very certain he was on it after 1985, and I think he had, he is long since retired. I think he owned an auto shop in Morehead City, but I remember his wife was in the background saying that he had just got rid of a box of old pictures, and there was a picture of him on the Sea Fever.
Wow.
After 1985, and I would have loved to have had that picture.
Yeah.
But so I think there's a good possibility the Sea Fever survived. December of 1980. I think there's a good possibility. Yeah. I can tell you the boat was a Coast Guard documented boat. And so the Coast Guard has bills of sale on this boat going back to the 60s when it was built. We haven't gone all the way back. I have those. Yeah. And the boat kind of disappeared. That doesn't mean it didn't continue to be sort of floating around, undocumented or documented in some state somewhere. Who knows? I'm sure at this point the boat is long gone, probably, sunk somewhere or, sitting abandoned in some boatyard or somewhere. But I think there's a good possibility that the boat did come back to the United States after the disappearance of the girls and the three guys, which is a really compelling fact when you think about the potential of foul play to be involved here. And there's other areas aside from the drug aspect that makes you really think about the foul play.
Right. I think it's what's going to stick with everybody is this customs agent, even knowing where you were going before you went there regarding the sea fever and Theresa and Angela. What I want to get into now, being that we've talked, of course, about the Hannahs already, given that we don't have any video or fingerprints, no forensics or anything, with, I guess you can say, you're saying now that with a high degree of certainty that it was the Hannahs on this boat and some other guy. How did you eventually come to this conclusion? Simply because the Hannahs bought the boat, or was there other information that came into that you can proclaim that?
Well, finding the records of the guy in North Carolina selling the boat to one of the Hannah brothers, that was part of it.
Okay.
JSO had identified Mark Jacobs as the owner of the boat.
Okay.
Well, Charles Hannah's middle name was Mark. Mark Jacobs was a known alias of Charles Hannah.
Wow.
So his brother Clyde, some old JSO reports that said the other guy on the boat was Michael Hamilton. Clyde Hannah, who was Charles' brother, he has an alias of Michael Hamilton.
Wow.
Was able to figure that out because they had been arrested and the real fake names had all linked up. And, some of these records that this customs agent had sort of put on the two guys with getting the suspect and them getting fake driver's licenses in Florida.
Yeah.
So that's how I was able to piece together those two. And there's a third guy mentioned in the JSO reports who identified him as James Wilson or Michael Wilson.
Okay.
Michael Wilson is a real person.
Okay.
Also from Pinellas County. I think his sister still lives there.
Okay.
Pinellas Park, I think. He was kind of younger than the Hannah brothers. Had a little bit of criminal history, but nothing near as extensive what the Hannah brothers had. And he had a girlfriend who was supposed to go on the boat, but she didn't. She didn't go on the boat for some reason. So he was the third guy, and I found his sister, who was still alive. She knew that her brother, had disappeared, and but didn't know it was on this boat. Was able to confirm it with I think I got a mugshot of his from Pinellas County Jail. They have mugshots going back to the 70s, and was able to get mugshots for all of these guys. And his sister said, "Yes, that's my brother." And so she knew that he disappeared on some boating venture, but she had no other information, no details why. All these years later, so I can say, and I spoke to the Hannah brothers, their parents have passed on. They had a stepmom that was still alive and a stepbrother still alive. I spoke to them, and they knew that they disappeared on the sea. They knew that. So yes, so based on all of those records of figuring who the names really were, the sale of the boat, and then speaking to living family members of all three of them who confirmed, yes, that it was that boat. I think there's no doubt these were the three guys that were on the boat. Now, it's a question: was there a fourth guy? Did a fourth guy, get on the boat later on? I don't know. There's because you remember, if you go back to when the Sea Fever kind of first got busted by the Coast Guard, there was a guy named Stephen Duffy. Fast Eddie was on it.
That's right.
I don't know. Who knows? Was Fast Eddie on the boat when it left Jacksonville? Nobody really knows, because it's not like an airline where you've got a manifest of all the ticketed passengers. You don't. You don't know, but I know, we certainly know Angela and Theresa were on it because, father drove them.
Right.
Angie's sister reported her missing. Certainly know that. And I no doubt that the Hanna brothers and Wilson were on the boat, but was Fast-Eddie on the boat then? Maybe, who knows?
Right,
Maybe he was there too. I do know there was some recollection that the parents had that they got phone calls from the girls, and I think there's some confusion about whether the sea fever left Jacksonville, and this is another thing that's really interesting.
Yeah.
They had told everybody they were going to be back by Christmas. I think you knew that.
Yep. Of course.
They
At
were
least
gonna
2
be back by
weeks.
Christmas.
The popular, I think, idea was like 2 weeks.
Yeah, and they were gonna cruise the Bahamas, which on a boat like that, to cruise the Bahamas, it would take about 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
That would you could take a couple day train to get over there.
Right.
You kind of go around a little bit. A week or two is appropriate. Well, they got a phone call after they left, and the girls said that they were in. I think it's unclear if it was Fort Lauderdale or Fort Myers.
Okay.
Both. For your listeners, both of those are the southern half of the state.
Sure.
One's on the east side, one's on the west side,
Totally
almost completely opposite of each other.
Yes.
Not sure which one it was, but the girls' parents did very distinctly remember getting a phone call from the girls when they had stopped in either Fort Lauderdale or Fort Myers. I don't know which one it was, but that's not the direction of going to the Bahamas. And then you remember there's the December 14th phone call,
right,
that I think the Hickmons got.
Theresa,
and that was there's records of that. There's documents in the old sort of records about that phone call where the girls were in the Cayman Islands. That's a long way from Jacksonville. That's a long way from Fort Myers, and that's not the Bahamas.
Right, and I think in thinking about it, when Denise and Anita were on here, and we start talking about calls, I mean, that's from another country. That would not have been a cheap call in 1984.
No, and they were in a hotel, and I know from speaking to this goes back to the whole Noriega thing. Yeah, that whole operation with Lee Rich, Stephen Kalish, and the FBI undercover agent, whose name is out there. He's been on a couple podcasts. His name is Ned Timmons. Very interesting story he has. They ran that operation largely out of the Cayman Islands. So those guys were able to, I spoke to them. They were all very helpful. Wanted to sort of go through their memory and their records to kind of see who these guys were, and they didn't know these guys and their real name or their alias, but based on the information I shared about where they were from and the locations, they all kind of came to the same conclusion that they were very likely working under one of Mike Vogel's guys that was out of Detroit with a smuggling group. Nonetheless, back in 1984, there were only two hotels on the Caymans. There was a Holiday Inn and a Ramada. And I think back in the 80s on one of the shows with the psychics that they went on, one of them, I think it came out that it was the Holiday Inn. I don't know how somebody knew that, but that came out somewhere. You can kind of get deep in there and find that. But what was documented back then, and what some of the family members I spoke to still remember, was they heard a man in the background telling Theresa to get off the phone. Get off the phone. Now, was that because they didn't want the room charge of the international call? I don't. Who knows? But the tone of, Theresa making that call and telling her to let Angie's parents to know that she was going to be home soon. Angela didn't seem happy, didn't seem comfortable. She seemed a little bit worried, and then it was abruptly ended by somebody, being told to get off the phone.
Yeah.
And then there's records, and there is records. The Cayman Islands was able to confirm back then, and that there was the boat Sea Fever did come into the Caymans, I think around December 10th or so. So we know, we know the Sea Fever left, I think, December 1st.
Yeah.
Made a stop somewhere in South Florida, whether it was Fort Lauderdale, Fort Myers, and then ends up in the Cayman Islands around December 10th, somewhere around there. And then there's the phone call on the 14th, and then it sort of disappears until you have that sighting in North Carolina a couple years later. So
the boat comes back to the United States, but seemingly the two women and these three guys that you've mentioned, the Hannahs and Michael Wilson, did not. Seemingly.
No, I mean, almost confirmed by the families. They never, this is almost like the open line of your podcast. Never seen again.
That's
They were unfound.
Right.
They were.
Thank you, Caleb. Yes, that's true.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, they were unfound. But the part where it gets real interesting is, when I mentioned earlier, was Fast Eddie on that boat or not? That's where I think this gets really interesting, because
let's just go right into that. Let's go right into what did he eventually, somewhere down the road, I know you know the time, somewhere down the road, somewhere not in Florida, but he was questioned, and what did he have to say? Yeah, so
Fast Eddie, who, you remember, he was on the Sea Fever when it got busted by the Coast Guard a few months prior to this, Florida smuggling drugs. He is from Detroit, self-professed, member of the Hells Angels. He's still alive.
Yes.
Last I checked, he's in a sort of assisted care nursing facility not too far from you, Ed. He's not too far from not too far from you.
Yes.
But so he's still alive. So in the late 80s, I think somewhere around 1986 or so, he's encountered at an airport, at an international airport. Not sure which one. I think it was probably Detroit, and he had a sort of record on him because of the Sea Fever and the disappearance of the girls, that sharp customs agent in North Carolina had kind of put that record on him. So the customs inspector that encountered him when he came in, when he flew in internationally, who knows where he was coming from, asked him about the Sea Fever. Yeah. And his response was documented in a was documented in a report that is still out there, and it was something to the effect of, a lot of people died on that boat, I'm not talking about it. And then he goes on his way. Barnes gets arrested shortly after that by the DEA for smuggling, bringing cocaine into the Detroit International Airport. He's indicted, prosecuted, does time in federal prison. That's all public. You can see all that. Gets out of federal prison, does a couple stints in state prison in Florida, and, had a stroke a few years ago, and is best I learned, he's really unable to talk. But, that's real interesting that he knew a lot of people died on the boat. And that's different from saying the boat sunk and people died. It's a different way of explaining it.
It certainly is. Right.
And the other thing that's weird about it is, when you go back and look at some of the older reports on this, and even some of the family members that are still around today, they remember they got a call from one of the girlfriends that didn't go on the boat, that shortly, I think by January, I think the Hannah brothers' parents called and said, the boat disappeared. They're all gone. They perished. Well, how did they know that back then? There was no cell phones. So somebody knew that something happened, or knew to say that something happened. But there was no documented sort of search and rescue done down there. There was no distress call, but somehow one of the girlfriends didn't go on it. Just calls the parents, say, "Oh yeah, he's gone. He's not coming back. He didn't make it." And then you have Fast Eddie that makes a statement to a customs inspector that a lot of people died on that boat, not talking about it. And then you have fairly credible sightings of the Sea Fever showing back up in North Carolina with, the Hanna brothers, Mike Wilson, Angie and Theresa. They're not on it, but the boat's on it. So I think you could, if Fast Eddie was not on the Sea Fever when this happened, he at least knew or still knows something about what did transpire, because why else would you say a lot of people died on that boat? You would say, I don't know anything. I don't know what happened. It disappeared. I was on that boat once and never again. And why would you get one of the girlfriends that didn't go on the boat? Why would she call, one of the parents and say, "Oh, the boat's fine"? Well, how did she know that? How would you know that back then?
Right. Well, let me jump in here. Is she still alive? Have you tried to talk to her or what? Do you know who she is or what?
No, could never figure out her name.
Oh my. Wow.
There's some of the family members remembered that one of the Hanna brothers kind of had a girlfriend that didn't make it on the boat. Mike Wilson's brother had Michael Wilson had a girlfriend that didn't make it on the boat.
Yeah.
And then never could really figure out who she was. Your researcher Eric is really good at looking at newspaper, old newspaper stuff and addresses, and who knows, maybe he'll come up with something, because it would be real interesting if she was alive and she wanted to talk. It'd be real interesting. Well, how did you know that? How did you?
Right.
Who told you that everybody disappeared on the boat? And could never figure that out.
Right. And we should mention some things. By the time you got involved in 2023, Fast Eddie had already had his stroke. So you never had an opportunity to talk to him because of that.
No, myself and the agent, reserve agent I told you about, who's a U.S. Marshal on his regular job. We drove up there to try to go find him.
Yeah.
And found the house he was at, but he's in a nursing home, and his niece, I think, was taking care of him. And I understand where she's coming from. We told her what we wanted to talk to him about, and she said she was going to kind of think about it, and she was very nice and called back and said she just didn't really see the value in sort of putting him through the stress. And I understand that. I mean, it certainly would have been nice to see if he could have tell us something, but I can understand a family member that's that advanced in sort of age and ill health that had a stroke. Maybe you don't want to put him through the stress of that. I understand that.
This is, I have to ask, because I just saw an episode of old Law and Order about this. This isn't like some mafia don pretending like he lost his mind or something, he's not, I guess what I'm saying, he's not faking it, is he, Caleb?
No, because we did go to a nursing home that he had been at previously, and some of the staff there remembered him, and he even showed me a photo of him, and they remembered that he was kind of like a self, he was very open that he had been a member of the Hells Angels, and they had even told me that he had I think a series of strokes, and they even said he had a lot of difficulty kind of verbalizing. So I think she was telling the truth.
Okay, just checking. Just had to ask. I should ask you this, something that really maybe we've kind of glossed over a little bit. You get involved in 2023. The way I remember things is I think Mr. Hickmon was deceased by then. I think he died of cancer in maybe 2019. Theresa Hickmon's mother maybe is still alive, but how about maybe talk a little bit about the interactions with Denise, with Anita, maybe with Theresa's sisters who never responded to me. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Theresa, I was able to speak to one of Theresa's sisters who, told me a couple of things that were interesting that I don't think anybody knew about before. Mm-hmm. She knew that Theresa, the story was that they had met these guys, the Hanna brothers, at this Po Folks restaurant.
Right.
That's been you've kind of covered that before, and that's been kind of out in the public domain.
Yes,
where the girls worked at, and they stayed in the apartments right behind them. That was the story, that they had met him there. But when you look at the some of the old investigation that JSO had done, which kind of crossed over into this kind of it stumbled upon this kind of real sort of interesting and crazy racketeering investigation involving an escort service, that JSO arrested some of the folks that were involved. Mark, one of the Hanna brothers aliases, had been confirmed as being a client of the escort service, and Angie and Theresa, we knew, were also sort of moonlighting in the escort service. I think one of her sisters even talks about one of them having a pager back then.
Yeah.
So, it's unclear if they met the girls through the escort service or if they met them at Port Brooks. I don't know, but the girls were sort of working as sort of escorts, and there's even one of the sisters even knew that Angie had gotten a necklace from, I remember it was Angie, had gotten a necklace from a guy that had like an anchor on it, very nautical. Sort of suspect it was one of the Hanna brothers because they were much involved with the boat. Kind of a real sort of mysterious thing. It makes you wonder, did Angie and Theresa even know their real names?
Right.
Or do they know them as the aliases?
Right.
There was a house that they were at in Palm Valley, which I think is a small area in St. Johns County, just south of Jacksonville.
Yep.
JSO tried following up on that address, that location. The house was for sale, so long gone. So a lot of dead ends.
Yeah.
Back then. Right.
Right.
So
you were I guess what I'm also asking you is, of course, we now know how you came upon this from this duty call. How soon into this process did you end up talking to the Westberrys and the Hickmons? How quickly did that happen?
Oh, probably within a matter of days or weeks, and then over the course of the next year, sort of piece this all together and started talking to these other people that had been involved with sort of the Knew the Sea Fever and some of these retired federal agents that had been involved. Yeah, it was sort of a long sort of road that I went down as I sort of put together pieces of this puzzle to try to get answers, ultimately to figure out, what happened to these girls and these three guys after I knew who they were, and was there foul play? I don't think there's any dispute. Even look at the old JSO reports from 1985-86, and they write foul play suspected.
Okay.
And I don't think there's any dispute that there wasn't some foul play here. Right. It's very there was some sort of foul play. Now, who was behind it, what the foul play was, I don't know. We may never know. But even in 2026. There's probably a few people out there besides Fast Eddie that probably know something that we don't already know about this. There's somebody probably knows something.
Right. And this is something, when I first became interested in this disappearance, once again, way before I ever started this podcast 10 years ago, of course, my thinking, as an amateur not knowing a lot about disappearances at the time, was these two girls were murdered and at least two guys got away with it. They took her on this boat, killed her, and they went on with their lives, and it's a mystery as to who these guys are. They went on their lives. I didn't know, did they own the boat? It was all a mystery. But now, of course, I was totally wrong in that the girls went missing, the young women went missing, and these three guys went missing, and it's, the reason I couldn't put that all together, and this is where I want to ask you about this, is because there were missing persons reports filed for Theresa and Angela, but not for the Hanna brothers and Michael Wilson. any insight into that? They're still not on the federal database, and not on NamUs. Any insight into that?
No, there wasn't for the Hanna brothers. I think that the Hanna brothers, the parents, and then the stepmom, stepfather, they had siblings on both sides.
Yeah.
I think they knew what these guys had gotten into. There's the stepbrother who was about 10 years old in 1984, 82. He remembered the older Hanna brothers coming to Houston with a limousine and women. He thought that the women might have been Angela or Theresa. He can't make a photographic comparison.
Okay.
I think I asked some of the family members if they ever remember the girls going out of town to Texas. They did not remember that ever happening. I think people as young as the girls were, particularly Angela, I think they probably would have remembered them taking a trip with these guys out of town. Because I believe that this trip on the Sea Fever that was supposed to be 2 weeks to the Bahamas, I think that was like the first time Angie had sort of, gone out of town with anybody.
Right.
So,
yes.
So I don't think those girls. I don't think those girls were, the same girls that came to Houston. But these guys, had a ton of cash all of a sudden, and limousines, and fancy women, and showing off. Who knows where it came from? But I think the family. I think the family kind of knew where it came from. What is interesting, though, is Michael Wilson's sister did tell me they had made a missing persons report in the small police department where he lived at the time. It's one of the really small municipalities in Pinellas County, very...
we talked about this. We're not sure, right? I'll have to figure out which municipality it is. Maybe Eric has it in his notes or something. Certainly one of it's not Largo...
No, that's a bigger...
Gulfport.
No, those are bigger. Those are bigger cities over there. It was so small that I'm somebody that's from Florida, so I know most of the.
Yeah.
This is not one I had heard of.
Oldsmar,
but it's not Oldsmar.
Okay.
It's a little bit further west.
Okay.
A little bit
Tarpon
further west.
Springs. Tarpon Springs. It's become a geography podcast all of a sudden. I'll have to look it up. We certainly want to get to the bottom of that, being that I live in this county, and probably I did read it and all the stuff Eric has sent me. It's just not coming to me right at this second, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, me either. We'll figure it out.
Okay, so somebody did.
In any case,
somebody did file a report in this small municipality in my county.
They said that they filed one there. So I went to this little police department, and I think that this had like one detective, and he checked, and they didn't have any records. But as I've come to learn, going back that long ago, unfortunately, a lot of places purged records, even for missing persons, if they didn't properly put them in all the databases or whatever. So making a missing persons report is not the same as that police agency putting that person into all the right databases to make them a missing person. I think that's something that is a point of confusion. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Just because you report them missing to the police does not mean that they're going to report them, if that makes sense.
Right. Just because they file a report doesn't mean they're going to get into NamUs.
It just came to me.
Okay.
Kenneth City.
Kenneth City, right. That's near St. Pete. That's down that southern. Kenneth City is down there near St. Pete. It is.
Yes.
It's almost directly to the east from Madeira Beach.
Yes, but remember the Hanna brothers had connections to Madeira Beach and went to high school over that way.
That's right.
So the Wilsons at the time lived in Kenneth City, which, I had never heard of it when I went through it. I said, this is a really tiny city with a real small police department, and you're from over there. I think I'm right. This is it's so small you couldn't even think of the name.
Kansas City, probably not one of the better known little places.
No.
Maybe just because now that I've spent so many years in northern Pinellas, like I said, Kansas City's getting down there, very near to St. Petersburg, Florida, like I said, where the Rays play currently. Yeah.
But that's where the Wilson family lived at the time. They're certain that they made some sort of report to the Kansas City police. They may have, but there's no record of it. They had nothing, and none of these guys were entered into the various databases of missing person. Just the girls.
That's right. Right.
Yeah.
Is that something that, once again, we're doing this interview today. I know you're going to continue to work on this. Should that be something that is an important item to get them on there, or how do you view that as an investigator?
I think at this point there's been such a passage of time. It's been so long, and I think we have so many indications that these three men and two women are very likely deceased. I think it's probably sort of a dead end. So the end of the road for me on this journey was Fast Eddie, and that was kind of where we pumped. That was kind of the end of it for us, because he was the last kind of person that kind of knew something about it.
Right.
Certainly if new information came to light and there was somebody still alive or some record, I would certainly try to look into it to see if we can kind of piece together what happened. But I think I think they're deceased. They're not just unfound. They're deceased. And my agency's interest in something like this is to see if we can, figure out what happened, because obviously the families deserve some sort of closure. And, I didn't figure out exactly what happened, but I think I know a lot more of the story than what people knew prior to 2024, just a couple years ago. I know a lot more. People didn't even know the names of these guys and some of the background and things like that. So where it's one step closer to closure for them. It's not great news, but it's you kind of have an idea that they got involved with some bad dudes, right?
Right.
I think that's kind of apparent. But my interest in this really was to get some sort of closure, sort of happen, and if there was a way to develop enough evidence to bring about a prosecution for a homicide on the high seas with somebody that was still alive.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. And I think at this point, that's probably just not going to happen. Who knows if the people that were responsible for whatever this foul play was caused disappearance, who knows if they're still alive, if we could even figure who they were, and then also be able to develop the evidence to prove what happened. Probably not going to happen. But, the one thing that when you do this type of work, the thing that's hard to not think about is if only somebody had done X, Y, and Z in 1985,
Absolutely.
Or if I had gotten this case 10 years earlier, might be totally different.
Yes. Right.
Or
even, I know Mr. Hannah's father, who seemed like, I guess, the stand-up guy. If you'd have gotten to talk to him, maybe he would have been able to tell you who one of the, more about all of this. Maybe.
Yeah, you see this happens all the time where, I looked into another disappearance around the same time frame that's kind of also popular, of Lisa Bishop. Spoke to her boyfriend at the time, and he had just gotten rid of a box of all of his records he had used. And he spent many years trying to look for her, figure out what happened, had kind of identified, a suspect. And it was, and when I contacted him, he had just gotten rid of those records. And you see this happen too. With that gentleman in North Carolina that I found that knew Kaufer and knew the sea fever, and his wife said they had just gotten rid of a box of old photos where there was a photo of him on the sea fever in 1986 or 87, and it's just like, if I'd have just been, you just missed it. There's a lot of that happens in this type of work, where these older, colder cases and disappearances, just stuff disappears. People move on. People got to throw away stuff. Government agencies don't keep records forever, and people pass away and forget. Some of them, they forget things too.
Right. But it does seem to me, we have already mentioned her once. It does seem to me maybe that kind of that thing that's out there, kind of like with Charlie Bucket and the Golden Ticket, with Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, is if this girlfriend who seemingly knew something is still alive. If you could track her down, that's like the golden ticket, right? Being that
it could be, and she is somebody who would have been in her early 20s in 1985.
Yeah, she
could still very well be alive.
Absolutely.
She could still be alive, but nobody. I tried a number of things to kind of figure out. Who she was. Unfortunately, there was no, Instagram, Facebook in 1985 where you could figure who people's friends were.
Let's just very specifically, Caleb, who is she? We don't know her name. Who is she? She is the girlfriend of who, and where would she probably be from? Or, where did she live at the time, etc.?
I believe her name may have been Krista.
Okay.
May have been Krista Watson, maybe, who knows.
Okay.
And I think she was from Pinellas. I think she was from the Pinellas County area.
Okay.
So,
right,
not sure about the name. That name pops up. Mm-hmm. Not sure if that's her or another friend that was involved, but pretty certain that she had ties to Pinellas County and was Michael Wilson's sort of girlfriend at the time. But other than that, it's kind of like a needle in the haystack. But there may be somebody out there that Michael Wilson was supposedly a roofer in Pinellas County, and I think he kind of got pulled into this sort of moving kind of drugs on boats thing. Yeah. Maybe there's somebody that knew Michael Wilson in the early days of Pinellas County that might know exactly who this girlfriend is. Who knows?
Right. She would, if she was 21 in 84, should be 63 now.
Yeah, she could be.
Very high percentage chance she's still alive.
She could have been as young as 18 back then, maybe as old as 25-ish. So well within the range of somebody who could still be alive. Right.
And one more thing on that, she was supposed to go on this trip and didn't. Is that the story, or is that somebody she was supposed to go and didn't?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Lucky for her, I guess. Lucky for her.
Yeah, it's somebody was looking out for her.
Right. Just from of course we're over 2 hours, but I still have some things I want to discuss with you. But just to wrap this all up, regarding all of this, of course, I know this. I've covered 400 disappearances over the last 10 years, interviewing family members, almost 1,000 family members, and everything. And of course, we've talked about that time. That's why this series that I put together exists and everything. Still, all of these disappearances fairly rare from a criminology standpoint, from investigation standpoint, Caleb, it seems whatever happened here maybe was kind of rare. Does that give you any insight into what could have happened? We know that people get killed due to drug running and things, but for 2 women, at least 3 men, maybe more people that we don't even know about to go missing, and probably murdered. How do you view that?
Well, I think it's strange, even when you look at the technology that existed on boats and search and rescue and navigation. Back then there's this thing called the RAN, which was kind of like a ground-based radio signal triangulation system that the Coast Guard had set up around the world, and boats would kind of use this to figure out where they were. And this boat may have had Loran or may not have. Who knows? GPS back then was only available to the military, so now just about every boat has a GPS. But even in the early '80s, boats had radios. Yeah. Boats had flares. Yeah. The boat could have run into trouble in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico between the Cayman Islands and going back to Florida. Could have been sunk. Could have been no radio call that anybody would have heard. That's possible. The weird thing is when people especially back then, when you didn't have that navigation and communications technology, you would kind of do what you might call a float plan, where you would kind of have your plan of who was going on the boat, and you would kind of let somebody know, like, hey, I'm going to be coming into this marina, this port, and such date. If I'm not here by then, that's how you need to launch the Coast Guard. That's how a lot of, and this still happens every now and then, where a boat that was supposed to come in doesn't show up, and that prompts a response by the Coast Guard. But back then it was more important because you did not have all of the navigation stuff, right? So, it seems kind of weird that, maybe these guys wanted to stay under the radar, so they didn't tell anybody. But I don't know. I think it's very strange and probably unlikely when we look at all the other little facts. That strange phone call that Hickmon's parents got. Yeah. Fast Eddie's statement about people dying on that boat. I think it's very unlikely that this was just sort of like a mishap, a search and rescue thing gone bad, where the boat sunk or the girls fell off. Well, I don't think that's how this happened, because there's a lot of, it so happens to this day, where a boat was going from Florida to the Bahamas or Florida to the Cayman Islands, and it just disappears. Yeah. Right. But you don't have these other weird sort of facts that come into play that makes you think otherwise. So I do think that there was foul play here.
Yeah, it must have been something kind of unique. Once again, we know that death surrounds smuggling and everything, but a group of people like that, not just they're probably dead, but they're missing, is something. It really sticks out. Yeah. It really sticks out.
Yeah, it does. It sure does.
Yeah. Okay. All right, well, that is Caleb's. Once again, we've covered a lot of people, a lot of locations, dates, and everything. This has been Caleb's work. You started this in 2023, through 3 years of your life, Caleb, working on this.
Yeah, and like I said, we kind of came to a stopping point. We just kind of came to sort of a dead end. But that barrier. If something changed, we would take another look at it.
Right. Let's move on now to just a couple other disappearances. I realize you didn't work on them, but just general insight. But I'm going to go to Tony Schwark, and I know that I gave you his sister's number. I don't know if you ever talked. We could certainly edit this out if you haven't. Did you actually talk to Lisa? Of course, he went missing, being you just talked about a boat going missing. Did you have a chance to talk to her about that?
I think I had, this was a while ago, I think I had a couple of, I think I may have exchanged an email with her. Yeah. Looked into that one a little bit, did not have any sort of breadcrumbs to sort of start with, as I did with the Sea Fever and Angela and Theresa. There wasn't, I think I remember there was a little bit of stuff with Tony Schwark, but not really enough that I could really sort of pull any string on.
Right. Yeah. Just to remind, of course, this is we're doing this. This is the episode that's coming out tomorrow. Of course, this will be the second time featuring Tony's disappearance. Of course, he was with another guy. His name was Dennis, and then another guy who we believe to be somebody actually from the Bahamas. They went out there, flew out there to bring a boat back to Florida. There are ideas that this was about drug running, although I would not say anything that's overtly, of overt certainty. Certainly not like what we're talking about with Theresa and Angela and the Hannahs and others. Certainly not like that. But this is a boat trip. Something went on between the Bahamas and Florida. So you've had a chance to talk to Lisa, and once again, like you said, not as much information out there. Like you said, breadcrumbs, like you said, with the sea fever, etc.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think kind of the premise of this one was that it was going to be Tony was sort of hired to be what you call a delivery captain,
That's
just
right.
kind of move a boat.
That's right.
For somebody, and that's a common thing in the industry. But usually when you're moving a boat like that, it's because the owner is sort of a snowbird and moves it from colder weather in the summer, in the winter, to warmer weather in the summer, moves it back and forth, or you're moving a boat because it's been sold or going to be sold. So a lot of these delivery captains, most of them that are having experience, they're going to be very particular about, looking at paperwork for a boat, inspecting things, because they don't want to take a boat that they have no experience with on a long voyage to move it if it's not seaworthy. So that's a little odd that this was a delivery, if Tony Schwark had a background as delivery captain, and if he did, would he have taken a boat that he had not kind of checked out, given a once over to make sure it was all in tip-top shape? So that's a little odd to me.
It is, especially given that Tony and Dennis had no boating experience at all.
Yeah, why would you hire somebody to move a boat for you as a delivery captain? And this boat wasn't a huge boat, but it certainly was not a little 10-foot bay boat. It was worth some money. Why would you hire a guy that had no background in that? That's kind of odd.
It is. It certainly is. And in the episode, and I think both interviews that I've done with Lisa, she's very open to the idea that Tony and Dennis could have probably caught up in something illegal. She did say that if something illegal, would they do it for money? She said probably.
Yeah, so, I think there's a good possibility, especially with all of the the Wild West you talk about with drugs moving into Florida back then in the 80s, and the Bahamas was one of the routes. It wasn't the other one, but it was one of them. It was one of them. It still is.
Right. Now let's move on to this. Once again, I realize that you've actually attempted to look into this just to see what you can find. I guess there's nothing, and that's really where I'd like to go with this. The episode that will be coming out, this will be episode 4 of this series of disappearances off the Atlantic coast of Florida. Eugene and Melanie Pavey, of course, they were going the opposite direction. They were going from Florida to the Bahamas, never ended up there. Eugene Pavey certainly in the drug business, as his daughter Dallin talks about. But you've talked to Dallin. I want to really, I think she was thrilled to talk to you, by the way.
I'm sorry, I didn't have any more information for her.
She was thrilled, and she's been working on this very hard, and to have a federal investigator like you to talk to about this and look into things for her, she really appreciated that. But on that note, of course, you went into the records, you really didn't find anything surprising, not surprising. How do you view that? Of course, this is a disappearance that's 44 years old.
Well, what was surprising to me with his daughter makes no mistakes that her dad was moving drugs.
Yep.
There was money. Makes no mistakes about it.
Yep.
Went, and she's very, very credible and sort of believable in her recollections and her memories about it. And even going to dinner with Griselda Blanca, who was
right.
She was like the female pop version of Pablo Escobar. She was a big deal here in Miami. And so it's strange that, and I didn't check every possible place where there could be information about him being involved in drugs, but I checked a couple of places where I certainly thought I was going to find some sort of record, and there was nothing. Which was there's a couple other places that I did not check because I have to go to another agency to do it, where maybe have something, but I was surprised that in the places that I looked, there was nothing. When I looked in even the federal, court system. Could not find anything in there, and she, I think, was certain that her dad had done a small stint in a federal facility up in Eglin, Florida.
She said that. Yes.
It still may be there. It just may be so old that you got to go and find. It's difficult to find. You got to go to the National Archives and other things like that. But the lack of sort of law enforcement information, even in systems that would still exist today about him, was a little bit surprising to me based on what she knew about what her dad was doing.
Right.
And his young wife as well, nothing.
That's right. Yeah, it's, there's a lot of questions. Once again, this is what happens when, as you've already stated, when you start looking at disappearances that are this old. Of course, people die, people's memories change, and with his, there's this whole thing, or they went out there and then they had a boat problem, so they went to Fort Lauderdale. Well, did they leave on the 2nd? Did they leave on the 3rd? It's still somewhat unclear on the timeline of all of that. I think that's also what makes this a big question mark. But just being that you are in Miami, you're an investigator. We understand you're technically you're an investigator. Just on boating in general, going out there to the Bahamas or coming back, being that you live over there, is that dangerous? Even on a nice day, is it dangerous?
Well, it certainly can be if your if your boat has an issue that you couldn't troubleshoot and fix on the spot, and if you're not good with the weather, I was recently out 40 miles off the coast of Florida in relatively calm weather, and then ended up out of nowhere in a storm with sea conditions and wind and rain like I've never been in before, and it came out of nowhere. I mean, obviously, if we were looking at the weather radar, we could see it coming, but sometimes, the way things move on the ocean and the effect that the weather will have on the sea conditions that it doesn't have on the land, you can't really appreciate. So, if you don't know what you're doing and you're not kind of watching the weather, even especially back then, it can turn on you in a dime and go from completely calm and normal to not. But the trek between and they were going to Marsh Harbor, Bahamas. I'm kind of familiar with the geography there a lot. That's the eastern kind of most part of the Bahamas, so it's kind of like the farthest to get. But when most boats go over there, they will go there around the north side of Grand Bahama. They will kind of hug the coast of Grand Bahama, which is Freeport's a big city there, and then you east of that you hit Great Abaco and Marsh Harbor of the Abacos. So it's you're in a place where if you got into trouble, somebody would hear on the radio, it's a little odd that if that's where they were going, that they couldn't signal for help and they just vanished. It's a little odd. I guess not completely impossible, but it's a little odd.
Okay. All right. So there you go. And once again, that interview's already been done a couple days ago with Dallin, and as everybody knows, we're doing this interview on May 28th. That episode will come out next Friday. We're pretty much to the end of this outline, but I know you did add some additional things in here. A particular woman, I don't want to say anything in case I have to edit out. Do you want to talk about some of those other things at this point, Caleb?
No, I mean, we talk quite a bit,
Okay.
You can, if people were interested, there have been cases that, my agency and others, FBI too, we have sort of successfully brought, sort of cases that look like disappearances or boating accidents that happen sort of on the high seas or off the coast of Florida or even in other countries. We have sort of brought them to a resolution, have been able to prosecute people. It's, certainly time is on your side when you get those. Every day that goes by, you lose more and more. Certainly, in this case, 40 years is a lot of time to lose stuff, but,
That's right.
But there have been some successes, and we don't. A lot of times, you don't find the people that are missing, but sometimes you can figure what happened, or if there was some sort of foul play or negligence, we are able to develop enough to, hold someone accountable for that. And that doesn't bring anybody back, but it gives some sense of justice and closure to the families, and hopefully sort of deters that sort of conduct in the future. But yeah, no, I think that's
okay.
People can kind of read, but some of that stuff is all public.
Okay. Just talk a little bit more about the CGIS in general. You even have the tips link on it here on the outline. But if there's anything else you want to talk regarding, the CGIS, your opportunity to do that right now.
No, I put the, we always like to plug our tips outline because sometimes, people don't know how to get a hold of the right federal law enforcement agency. If it's something involving a boat and your disappearance or any sort of crime involving a boat that somebody thinks might not be appropriate for sort of the local police where they live at, because if it happens on the high seas or whatever, we have an app that people can they can identify themselves if they want, or they can stay completely anonymous. They can upload, they can upload, photos or screen captures or whatever. But, there's, if you Google CGIS tips, you can kind of find that on the internet, and it's on our website, on the Coast Guard's website. But, I just like to plug that because we do get, every now and then we get a pretty good tip from the public that kind of breaks something wide open. And so, we just try, we try to get that out there. So,
right.
maybe someday one of your listeners might have something that they put into our tips app that sort of changes the entire case for somebody who's, a victim of a crime or missing or something.
So maybe to kind of go back to where this all started, at least for Theresa and Angela. Of course, there was this woman who called you originally. Did you keep her abreast as you were working on this? I mean, I don't know how much you were allowed to really say to her. Of course, if she's going to hear this podcast, then she knows. But it started just from that one phone call that you were able to find all of this. And, all because does this woman know now how much that phone call meant to the overall investigation?
Probably not. I think I sort of updated her sort of at the end to kind of tell her, found some stuff, sort of came to a dead end, but identified more information. But with her sort of not being related to any of the people that disappeared, I couldn't really share with her a whole lot. But she's certainly the Freedom of Information Act request that you guys submitted, you got you got very good information back, I think. But she certainly but no, that is a good point that if it wasn't for her thinking about this 40 years later and just calling JSO, and JSO told her to call us, and she got a hold of me, we now know more of this story. I don't, obviously I don't know sort of the ending, the last chapter, but I think we know a lot more now than what we did when you maybe first got interested in this 10 years ago.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, once again, as I've stated, I got this disappearance totally wrong, mainly because I thought that whoever these guys were got away with it. They were the murderers.
Well, and I think that's a logical...
Yes.
I think that's what you would, when you first look at it, that's what you would think.
Yes. Right. And that just shows you that, as I like to say, you can't use common sense and logic some of the times because you have a lot of facts that are missing. And, if we would have known, if it would have just been something as simple as the Hanna brothers' names on NamUs or the Wilkinson's guy on NamUs or something, then you could put it all together. Oh, all of these people missing. Oh, this is something different. But that was not reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Caleb, any final words before we complete this interview?
No, thanks for giving me the opportunity to kind of talk to you, and I'm glad that I'm not here officially, so nothing that I said was the sort of official stance of the Coast Guard Investigative Service, but they were okay with me sort of doing this on my own time, and we stuck to the things that are, sort of public records that you guys have got. And we can delve into, there's certain things that I kind of skirted around, but hopefully this is insightful for people.
No, it's fantastic.
And hopefully I'd never really been able to fully give this story to, Angela Theresa's family. And, maybe this episode kind of puts it all together and gives them a little bit more closer to closure than what they've had in a long time. And I don't know if that's going to make them feel better or worse.
Yeah,
but I hope
it's bittersweet.
I hope it makes them feel a little bit better.
It's bittersweet. Caleb, I've covered 400 disappearances. About 15% of them have been resolved to one way or the other, and every one of those resolutions is bittersweet. There is no complete sweetness.
Yeah.
There is no complete bitterness. It's all somewhere in between, because you get the answers, but that is the answer.
Yeah, and that's probably where we're at on this one in terms of somewhat of a resolution. Somewhat.
Yeah. Caleb, thank you for joining myself and all of the listeners on this episode of Unfound.
All right, Ed. Thank you so much. Take care.
And that was my May 28th, 2026 interview with investigator Caleb King of the Coast Guard Investigative Service. I thank him for joining me and all of you on this episode. I also want to thank my assistant, Eric. Of course, you heard from him in episode 1 of this series, and you'll be hearing from him again at the end of this series. But it's been Eric who has coordinated with Caleb and the Coast Guard Investigative Service for a year and a half. And all of that facilitated Caleb appearing on this episode. That was all Eric's work. I will say once again, as I've stated in the past few episodes, I will be doing a map video for all of the disappearances featured in this series, but I will not do that video until we are about at the end of this series. And of course, the video will be on Unfound's YouTube channel. I know many of you were highly anticipating this interview. I hope it did not disappoint. Here are the points that stuck out to me, and these clear up or even correct some of the points made during my interviews with Theresa and Angela from a month ago. Number 1, the Sea Fever was already on the Coast Guard watch list for running guns earlier in 1984 with Fast Eddie on board. What's still unclear is how both Eddie and the boat got off easy for such a crime. Why was the boat not impounded? Why was he not in jail? And concerning Fast Eddie, number 2, it seems that he might not have been on the Sea Fever for the fateful trip. Instead, Michael Wilson most likely was the third man besides the Hannahs on the boat. Michael Wilson seemingly disappeared at the same time as those men and the women. This does not absolve Fast Eddie from any responsibility, but it does make us really question if he alone could have killed 5 people. And that brings me to point number 3. Fast Eddie made a statement to government officials inferring that he knew what happened to the missing men and women. However, he was not very specific. What does this mean? Well, would he really intimate anything violent happening on the Sea Fever if he were responsible for it? You wouldn't think so. This probably could cause many people to change their minds, including myself, after what we heard a month ago from Angela's sisters. Overall, the issue is somebody or some group did do something to these 5 people: Angela, Theresa, the Hannahs, and Michael Wilson. They were almost certainly murdered. But even with the great work of Investigator King, we still don't know who that person or people are. We don't know when. We don't know how, and really, we don't even know where. I'm hoping, though, with this coverage, and now that Investigator King has exposed this new information to all of you, that it won't be another 42 years before we get all the answers. And that's the program. I'm Ed Dentzel, and you've been listening to Episode 6 of Unfound's coverage of disappearances that occurred off the Atlantic coast of Florida during the 1980s. Tune in next week for Episode 7, where you will hear about an experienced pilot and his plane that also went missing, this time in 1987.